Welcome to the RJLT Economics. In this podcast, I want to discuss why I don't believe that the Federal Reserve is going to quote-unquote pivot anytime soon. And I want to argue that the US dollar is the primary strategic asset of the United States. I want to develop today's podcast in two steps. First, I want to analyze why we have been hearing this story of a pivot from a lot of different sources. And then in step two, I want to argue that the dollar is the primary strategic asset. It is more important than the US economy at the current stage, and is certainly much more important than the quote-unquote market. A point that I want to make, of course, is that I'm doing this podcast because I've been recommended with a lot of such stories of pivot, and I just find them less and less convincing. In fact, some influencer, which I've been recommended with, had made repeated calls for that of pivot, saying that the Federal Reserve is going to pivot any day now. But this any day now has been like for about 2 months, and now this guy has just come up with some new video and talking smack as if he had never made those pivot stories, and he says things along the lines that this inflation is so deep and so important, so critical that it's going to get worse, and etc. All the nonsense. Okay, not nonsense, but a lot of his the points that the facts that he's observing are correct, but a lot of the points that he wants to make are flawed. I think because he wants to sell something. And whenever people want to sell something, it is questionable. You need to think first before you fully believe in what this person is telling you about. That's the first point I want to make. And second point I want to make is that actually I made this recording yesterday, but I found that I digressed too much. So in this new iteration of the recording, I'm going to try to digress less. Now let's start with the first point of today's discussion. Why are there so many talks about pivot? I think, again, this is about influence. It's about interests. It's not really about that. It's not really the knowledge of a weakening commitment of resolve of the Federal Reserve. I don't think the Federal Reserve has any resolve, but I think it's committed to this task. I don't think it has resolve, meaning that I don't think it believes that it will certainly win this fight against inflation. But I think it's committed to this task because of the number two, what I would discuss in step two. And that is fundamental. Without the US dollar, there will not be US economy. There will not be the any market. So this is primary. So this is something that they need to win, but they're not sure that they can win. I think that's probably most likely what is the situation there. Nevertheless, a lot of people who are talking about this Fed's pivot, that, in my opinion, shows some intellectual dishonesty by a lot of people, especially the Americans. Well, I don't know. Maybe this is just a systemic, but I have found that there are perhaps three types of motives. Right. Number one is that a lot of people want to sell some inflation hedge. They want to say that the inflation will get so bad, it will get much worse, that the Federal Reserve is never going to get this inflation under control before there's going to be a lot of damage to the economy. And this sort of people also like to make the arguments that if the Federal Reserve continues to increase the interest rate, there will be worsening inflation, that the economic damage will be worse, and you need this inflation hedge. To this, I think there's some intellectual dishonesty there, because how can you say that raising the interest rate is you need to raise a lot of very high interest, 20%, say for example, to go above the inflation. I agree that to get inflation under control. But you say that the Federal Reserve is never going to do that, but instead it's going to increase so little that it damages the economy, it makes lending more difficult, and it weakens the supply side of the economy, such that actually inflation goes up. That is a type of argument that I've been hearing. Do I agree with that kind of argument? I'm not so certain about this. I think the Federal Reserve is not so stupid because it's not acting when it tries to raise the interest rate. It is trying, indeed, in my opinion, to control the inflation because of the argument that I'm going to make in step 2. And another thing that I want to, the second type of people who are talking about this Fed pivot, what they are doing is trying to pump the market. They are entrenched in the investment. They probably have a lot of stocks, a lot of bonds, etc., and they want to get out. And in order to sell at the top before it has totally crashed, what they have to do is to identify people, not Ponzi. Well, what is the word? Pawns, to identify pawns, or what is the other word? Pansy, whatever. Anyway, they to sacrificial lambs, let's say, that are going to buy at the top from them so that they can sell. This type of people, they tend to be a lot of the fund managers. They go on different channels, the mainstream or otherwise, and they want to talk that there is peak inflation, the economy is going to turn around, the Federal Reserve is going to pivot, etc., etc. The market is building a bottom, and this bottom is so solid that it is now the good time to enter the market, buy. Obviously, I think that's the motive. They want to sell. That's the motive. And thirdly, there are some people who are working at a lot of these big companies. These people are major shareholders of important businesses, and they are looking at just a few months away from their bonuses. So they want to have this year end at a high, right? They want to try whatever they can so that this year's bonus will be secured. So they are seeking their dividends. They're seeking to protect their dividends. I think these are the three types of people who are talking about the Fed's pivot. All of them are somewhat dishonest because what they are talking about is, well, I wouldn't say that they necessarily know that the Federal Reserve is not going to pivot, but that Federal Reserve is going to pivot. It's simply a wish, a hope that they have. So presenting their hope, their wish as the truth, the fact, the reality is something, in my opinion, dishonest. Now let's move on to the second part and perhaps the more important part of today's discussion, which is why I don't think the Federal Reserve is going to pivot. I think it's very simple. The very simple reason is that the US dollar is the primary strategic asset of the United States. Without the dollar, the United States will not be able to fund its war machine. It will not be able to fund regime change. It will not be able to fund the R&Ds, which still is done in the United States a lot, and the United States is still a leader in a lot of the high-tech areas. The United States, it will not be able to attract talents from across the world who flood to the United States for research degrees and then to work. These are very important aspects, right? And at the same time, the United States will not be able to fund its sanctions, will not be able to enforce sanctions across the world, will not be able to get countries in line to toe its line in favor of its foreign policies, and it will not be able to protect and solidify its alliances. And finally, crucially, the United States will not be able to fund its lifestyle. To be able to have the reserve currency of the world economy is so important that in my opinion, a lot of the people in the United States, the establishment, could possibly think that could possibly trade 1/3 of the US population just for having this right. And I think a lot of countries, a lot of world leaders are happy if they could trade 1/3 or half of their population, whatever fate, leave them to their fate, simply to have this luxury, this privilege. I think the United States is not going to give up so easily this privilege. And in fact, without USD, let's say the USD continues to inflate, that it loses its reserve status, what's going to happen to the US economy? Well, the stock market, all the markets that these guys who talk about pivot say that the Federal Reserve is so likely to protect, to preserve, there will not be market. The stocks, they will all crash, at least in real terms, and the living standards of Americans would just basically vanish, and there will not be any discussion about economy. There is no economy to save if there is no dollar. And similar arguments can be made for countries even without the status of a reserve currency. For economies in general, if you don't have a relatively stable currency, the economy simply cannot function. And without a functioning economy, you cannot have a functioning market. And then you won't have a country very soon. So the currency, this is the most important. And even if this means sacrificing the Biden administration, they will do it, because Joe Biden is simply a figurehead, to put it nicely, just simply a figurehead. And his administration is just a collection of actors or figureheads. It doesn't really matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans. It is the establishment that's going to always stay on top of the issues. So I think they are going to save the dollar ahead before they try to save anything. They will save the dollar before they save the economy, before they save the market, and certainly before they save Biden. If they could sell Biden to the devil to get the inflation down by 2%, they will very happily sell Biden to the devil. I'm pretty sure about that. And I think rather a more interesting discussion, a more interesting question is whether the US economy has reached peak inflation. This is something that is interesting, because if the US economy has reached peak inflation, this would mean that the pain would be slightly less going forward than if the pace of inflation continue to pick up. Because if the pace of inflation continues to pick up, some much more dramatic, much more drastic measures will have to take place for the Federal Reserve to keep inflation under control. And the likelihood of it succeeding is going to diminish over time. But if peak inflation has been reached, then gradually the Federal Reserve, with continued rate hikes and cuts in its asset purchase program can potentially see inflation actually come down to a more reasonable range, at which point the US Federal Reserve and the US dollar would have regained their credibility, and that means that they can go ahead with more quantitative easing and with more asset purchases to pump up the economy afterwards. So currency first, other things second, third, and for Biden last. All right, so this is today's podcast. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, follow me on Twitter and Telegram if you like. Share and subscribe. Thank you very much. Have a great day.